Racist clan tries to kill black man, unaware. He is a Delta Force commander. All it takes is a black man daring to step into a place they believe he doesn't belong. And that alone is enough to ignite a war he never started. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. That was something Gavin Johnson had yet to realize when he stepped out of his silver 1998 Toyota Tacoma, its wheels still dusted red from the 600-mile journey from Fayetteville, North Carolina, to Millbrook, a small town so quiet you could hear the wind knock against the lampposts each night. But within that silence echoed the weight of old prejudices, nurtured through silent dinners, unnamed closed-door meetings, and coded handshakes exchanged between men in white shirts. Gavin was 45 years old, stood 6 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a wall. But it was his eyes that drew attention, sharp yet steeped in weariness. Not the fatigue of age, but of having seen too much of what human beings are capable of doing to one another in Fallujah, Kandahar, Mogadishu. 20 years as a Delta Force operator, he had led assault teams on missions so covert no journalist would ever report them. Among U.S. Special Forces, he was known as the Ghost of Sector 9. But now, all Gavin wanted was to be an ordinary man, with a wooden porch, trees all around, and a life no longer ruled by gunfire. The land he had purchased, 47 acres on a gently rising slope beside the Chattahoochee River, once belonged to Jim Henderson, a white veteran who passed away 2 years ago. A 2-story wooden cabin stood in the middle of the lot, its white paint peeling, but its foundation still solid, facing the western mountains. Gavin paid in full, $340,000, wired from a combination of his military retirement fund and a smart real estate investment back in Fayetteville. No loans, no mortgage. Everything was legal and above board. But for the people of Millbrook, that was a problem. Joshua Briggs found out only hours after the sale closed. The man, in his 50s, owned the largest wheat farm in the county and had lost 2 town council elections, yet still quietly controlled much of the local life through the Heritage Society, a secretive organization where skin color and bloodline defined who was considered native. Joshua inherited not just the farm from his father, but also the deep-seated doctrine like a chronic illness. Millbrook belonged to white people and would always stay that way. Gavin didn't know Joshua's name on his first day here, but Joshua already knew him, knew that silver pickup, knew every visit he made to Murphy's Hardware, and most of all, knew he didn't belong here. That evening, Gavin stood on the wooden porch of his house, a glass of iced tea in hand, eyes fixed on the swaying oak branches beneath the moonlight. He didn't hear anyone, but he could feel it. Millbrook was watching him, not with eyes, but with shadows passing across window frames. And somewhere, in a dimly lit room, a plan was quietly being set into motion. He had no idea that he hadn't just bought a piece of land. He had stepped straight into a minefield of prejudice. And all it would take was one wrong move, and there'd be no way back. Millbrook wasn't the kind of place that shouted in your face that you weren't welcome. It was more subtle than that, like a room full of two-way mirrors, where Gavin stepped in and constantly felt someone watching from the other side. On his first Monday morning in Millbrook, Gavin drove his pickup truck to the main street to buy repair supplies. Murphy's Hardware was the oldest store in town, established in 1948, with a dark red facade and a brass bell hanging above the door. As soon as Gavin pushed the door open, the soft chime of the bell rang out, a tiny sound that seemed to trigger a strange reflex. 3 men in mechanic overalls simultaneously turned to look at him. It wasn't a look of anger, nor curiosity, but a quiet kind of exclusion, the kind Gavin had learned to recognize after 2 decades as a soldier. "You don't belong here." He moved toward the aisle with nails, hammers, and door locks. No one approached to ask if he needed help. The man behind the counter, thin, gray-haired, wearing an apron that read, "Murphy's since 1948, glanced at him quickly, then turned away. Gavin selected a Yale lock, an LED flashlight, and a spool of galvanized wire. When he walked up to the counter, the store owner's eyes passed over the $20 bill Gavin pulled out, then paused at his hand, slowly, as if inspecting the cleanliness of his skin. "You're the one who bought the Henderson place, right?" the man asked, his voice dry. Gavin nodded. "Yes, my name's Gavin Johnson." There was no welcome, not even a polite nod, just a stare, half suspicious, half uneasy. The owner tapped the price into his calculator and said nothing more. As Gavin stepped out the door, the three men were still standing there. One of them, holding a can of soda, smirked. "Strange, huh? Lots of strangers are coming to town these days." Then he chuckled softly, not looking at anyone, as if speaking to the air. That afternoon, Gavin stopped by Daisy's Diner, a restaurant that had been around since 1963, famous for its pot roast and cinnamon apple pie. He chose the farthest corner seat, back to the wall, eyes toward the entrance, old survival instincts never quite leaving him. Not long after, an elderly woman approached, carrying a coffee pot and wearing a gentle, sincere smile. "Good afternoon, sweetheart. I'm Betty Hawthorne. Just call me Betty." Gavin smiled. "I'm Gavin. Nice to meet you." "Oh, you don't sound like you're from Georgia," Betty said as she poured the coffee, her movements brisk, like a wartime nurse. "I'd guess Northeast, or maybe a retired soldier from Fayetteville." Gavin chuckled. "Sharp guess, Ms. Hawthorne. Just Betty. And I know a soldier when I see one. You're way too calm." Their conversation lasted nearly 10 minutes, the only time all day Gavin felt like a person, not a target. But when he looked up, through the glass window, across the street, at a small auto shop, a man was sitting on the hood of a car, pretending to smoke, but his eyes never left Gavin for even a second. When he returned home at 6:42 p.m., the rain had just stopped. There were fresh tire marks, but not from Gavin's truck. On the ground, near the porch steps, were unfamiliar boot prints, large, thick-soled, tracing a path from the field out back to the front door. And in the middle of the yard, directly aligned with the front entrance, stood a wooden cross, about 2 feet tall. It hadn't been burned, but the white paint had already turned yellow. A strip of steel wire was wrapped around its trunk, as if to say, "I don't need fire. I just need you to get the message." Gavin didn't touch it. He simply stood there, staring directly at the cross. A gust of wind swept through, bending the grass to one side, as if even the land itself was bowing before a storm barely begun. Gavin exhaled softly, then turned back inside, locking the door carefully behind him. This war wouldn't begin with gunfire, but with looks, shadows, and ancient symbols people thought had long been buried. But no, in Millbrook, they had only been sleeping. And now, it seemed, they had just awakened. Millbrook nights, as always, were silent and cold. But on the outskirts of town, inside an abandoned grain barn behind the old McAllister farm, deserted since 1998 after a suspicious fire, the flicker of a small flashlight danced across rotting walls and bundles of hay stacked chest high. There was no music, no greetings, only the musty scent of time and the smell of engine oil from the boots of Carl Dixon, still caked with dried mud. Joshua Briggs stood in the center of the room, in front of a wooden table cobbled together from an old stall door. He wore an old military jacket, hands jammed into his pockets, eyes scanning each man in turn. On the table lay a printed map of Millbrook, the 2012 edition issued by the Land Council, marked in red pen at 4 locations: Gavin's Farm, Grace Chapel Evangelical Church, Frida Chen's Bakery, the only Asian-owned business in town, and the football field, where 2 black families had recently enrolled their children. "He's putting down roots," Joshua said, voice raspy. "He's not here to test out a few months of living. 47 acres, reinforced log cabin, bulletproof doors, autonomous power systems. This is an outpost." Ray Peters, the auto parts shop owner on Main Street, crouched in the far left corner, flipping a Glock 23 over and over in his hands, safety off. "Who is he?" Ray asked. "I heard he used to be military." Frank Miller, president of First Southern Union Bank, a man still trying to look respectable in a place that had abandoned pretense, raised a beer to his lips, but didn't drink. "I looked into it," Frank said quietly. "No credit history, no debt, no mortgage. He paid for the entire property in a single transfer from an account in Fayetteville linked to a military fund. Tier 3 security clearance." "Delta Force," Carl Dixon muttered. "My brother-in-law's in the National Guard. Says those Delta guys aren't regular soldiers. They're killers." Joshua smiled. It held no humor at all. "Killer or not, he's still a black man in the center of our town. If he holds his ground here, then in 3 years, he will bring 2 cousins. In 5 years, this town will become a transit hub. In 10 years, your daughters will be in the same class as his kids. That's what you want?" No one answered. But no one left. Joshua walked toward the back of the room, where a yellowed whiteboard stood. He sketched a quick layout. Gavin's house, entry road, main doors, backyard. "We don't need to burn the house down yet. He's a soldier. He'll react like a soldier. But everyone has a limit. We take his sleep first, then his sense of direction, then his faith." Ray nodded. "I'll handle the tires. Slash him next time he drives into town." Carl added, "I know the pizza delivery kid. He can call at midnight, change his voice, and make threats. Then hang up." Frank hesitated. I don't want to do anything illegal." Joshua stared at him so long that the air seemed to still. "Frank, who's funded this group for the past 15 years? Who signs off on low-interest loans for members here? If you walk out of here and act like you didn't hear a thing, the FBI will call you the ringleader. But if you stay, you'll be protected, just like always." Frank said nothing, then nodded, barely. None of them knew that, just beyond the nearby hay bales, once used to shelter old harvesters, a pair of elderly eyes were watching. Betty Hawthorne hadn't come out of curiosity. She was looking for Ginger, her cat, missing since yesterday. But what she found wasn't fur. It was true. Betty clutched her old phone in both hands, battery at just 12%. She took 3 photos, recorded 38 seconds of audio. She wasn't sure if it would be enough, but she knew one thing. A storm was building, and this time, no one had the right to stay silent. Gavin Johnson had lived in places where there were no laws, only survival. Places where gunfire gave no warning, and trust was a luxury. So when the cross appeared in front of his porch, he didn't call the police. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a dual-encrypted SSD drive, plugged it into his laptop, and launched a familiar interface, a perimeter surveillance software he had once used while stationed in Al-Hadar, Iraq. Since the first day he arrived in Millbrook, Gavin had built his security ring. 4 4K infrared cameras were discreetly mounted around his property's perimeter, camouflaged with matte-painted wooden panels. A vibration sensor was installed beneath the front porch floor, capable of detecting human footsteps from 3 meters away. Even the doorbell was a modified version. It didn't chime, but every touch triggered a photo that was instantly sent to his phone and backed up to a secondary server in Virginia. Gavin didn't panic when the black Chevrolet pickup passed his house for the 4th time that week. He simply noted it in his logbook. License plate: QK 98423, time 7:48 a.m., Wednesday, speed, 12 miles per hour, well below the 25 miles per hour limit. Through the camera, he identified the driver as Carl Dixon. The man never looked directly at the house, but the reflection in his side mirror didn't lie. The next day, at the farmer's market nearly 4 miles from his house, Gavin found a 6-centimeter steel spike embedded straight into his front right tire. He didn't get angry, didn't complain. He just crouched down, took a picture, and called a tow truck. While waiting, he pulled out his phone and pointed the lens at the cafe across the street. 3 men were sitting there, among them Ray Peters, laughing smugly. None of them knew that in just a few days, their photos would appear in a file labeled Passive Interaction Surveillance Pattern, Millbrook. Gavin wasn't preparing for a stroll. He was preparing for a campaign. Back home, Gavin powered on the large screen mounted on his wall, what he called the tactical board. A digital map of the town was marked with red dots, locations of unusual movement, recurring time patterns, approach directions, and types of vehicles. Every potential target had its file, travel habits, social connections, suspicious affiliations. What Gavin had built wasn't just a defense system, it was a preemptive counterstrike network. That night, under the dim glow of his desk lamp, Gavin opened the file named Briggs. He was a different breed, not one of the drunk loudmouths on the street. He was dangerous precisely because he didn't need to shout. He manipulated, controlled, and steered the atmosphere like a silent conductor. Gavin had encountered men like him in the Balkans, those who seemed painfully ordinary on the surface, but trailed a wake of ethnic violence and corpses behind them. He added one more line to the file: Briggs, strategist, capable of organizing, does not act alone. From that moment, Gavin altered his routine. He never stepped outside without a firearm. Every night before bed, he checked all 4 main doors, 3 escape routes, 4 cameras, and 2 telescopic periscopes. He never lay down without knowing exactly how many movements had occurred within a 1-mile radius. To those other men, Gavin was just an outsider. But they had forgotten one thing. A man who survives 20 years in death zones is no prey. They had forgotten that sometimes the creature they think they're hunting is the one that strikes at the predator's throat. In Millbrook, the one being watched had started watching back. And in that calm, silent night, a veteran, without a uniform, without insignia, officially stepped back into the role he knew best: the predator. The 17th night of October in Millbrook began like every other, suffocatingly quiet. The sky was overcast, and a temperature had dropped to 46 degrees Fahrenheit. A thin mist blanketed the fields, concealing all movement beyond the eye's reach. But what hid in the dark wasn't just fog, it was intention. At exactly 1:42 a.m., 6 pickup trucks, Dodge Rams and Ford F-150s, quietly parked 200 meters southwest of Gavin's home, on the vacant stretch locals called the Henderson Patch. Headlights off, engines cut. Not a single word was spoken. 8 men stepped out, wearing wool beanies, gloves on their hands, boots wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. In their hands were chains coiled like whips, 1-gallon gas cans, and homemade torches wrapped in kerosene-soaked rags. Their plan was clear. Surround the wooden house in the middle of the field, ignite it from 3 directions, and force Gavin out in panic, like a rat being burned alive. Gavin knew. He had known for 30 minutes already, when the motion sensor placed 90 meters from the house sent an alert to his phone. The infrared system immediately triggered its silent alarm mode. No sirens, no flashing lights, just a simple message on the screen. Group movement, southwest. Confirmed. 6 vehicles, 8 individuals. He didn't run. Instead, Gavin shut off all the lights in the house, pulled on a thin Kevlar vest under his gray sweater, and slid a Glock 19 into the back of his waistband. In his hands was a Remington 870, short-barrel shotgun he had used during Operation Iron Mountain in 2011. It was already loaded. 1:55 a.m. A stone shattered the living room window. Wrapped around it was a crude piece of paper, hand-scrawled in red ink. "You've got 10 minutes to get out of Millbrook." Gavin opened the back door. No retreat, no negotiation, no begging. 1:58 a.m. The back door burst open under the force of 2 intruders with iron rods. But before they could step inside, a deafening blast rang out. One dropped to the floor, a bullet through his shoulder. The second fell backward, struck the thigh. 2 more rushed in from the left, but a shotgun blast from the kitchen blew apart the wooden doorframe, sending them scattering. Gavin fired with precision. Each shot is spaced just 1.5 seconds apart. Movements are sharp, economical, nothing wasted. He didn't shoot to kill, just to disable, to paralyze, to make them afraid. But there were too many. When the remaining 3 stormed through the front door all at once, he couldn't pivot in time. A blow to the back of the neck, cold, fast, precise, dropped Gavin to the floor. Before losing consciousness, he heard heavy breathing, boots thudding on wood, and a voice close to his ear. "You don't belong here." When he woke up, everything was freezing. He was chained by thick iron links to a pillar in an abandoned warehouse. Not an unfamiliar place. It was the same old grain barn behind the McAllister farm, where 3 weeks earlier, Gavin had driven past and noted it as a potential staging site. In front of him, under a dim yellow light, stood Joshua Briggs, with that half-smile that had come to symbolize arrogance, and Frank Miller, the bank president now trembling, holding a cup of black coffee in his hands. "Who do you think you are?" Joshua asked, his voice soft as a razor blade. "Some ex-soldier who thinks he can crush the history of an entire town?" Gavin said nothing. He stared directly into Joshua's eyes. No fear, no pleading, just a silence like stone. And in that silence, Joshua realized something. Even chained down, bound in the middle of the night, Gavin Johnson was still the threat he had never truly prepared to face. The yellow light cast harsh shadows across Gavin Johnson's face, forming deep patches like dried blood. The musty smell from the old wooden roof, mixed with human scent, alcohol, and sweat in the enclosed space, made the air inside the warehouse feel thick and heavy. He was chained with iron links to a rotting wooden pillar, its fibers cracked open, exposing a darkened core. His hands were bleeding, the collar of his shirt soaked dark. But his eyes remained unbroken. Joshua Briggs stood before him, hands in the pockets of a brown khaki jacket, eyes glinting with triumph. "We didn't want it to come to this, Gavin," he began, voice soft as wind brushing across a blade. "You have 2 choices. 1. Sign this paper, give up the land, and leave Millbrook forever. 2. Die. Right here. No one will know. No one will remember. No one will claim your body. And no one will care." Frank Miller, once seated behind the polished wooden desk in the director's office at First Southern Union Bank, now stood cowering behind Joshua, holding a stack of documents, sweat dripping down his collar. Inside that folder was a forged property transfer agreement, complete with fake signatures and stamps. A perfect con, if Gavin agreed to sign. But Gavin didn't move. Though his face was streaked with dried blood, eyes sunken and lips cracked, his gaze was piercing enough to chill the room. He exhaled slowly, then spoke with deliberate calm. "You people have no idea who I am." Joshua frowned. "Who are you? Some ghetto-born soldier with a few years of specialized training? Around here, you're just an intruder." Gavin let out a faint laugh. "I'm what you've never faced. I'm the history lesson this town forgot to teach you." Throughout the 2 hours he was chained, Gavin didn't panic, didn't rage. He listened to every gust of wind, felt the vibration of the floorboards with each footstep. He counted rhythms, footsteps, body turns, the clink of locks. He memorized everything. The main door was 8 paces northwest from where he sat. The small window behind him had rusted bars, bendable if pressed with weight. The chain was secured to a decaying pillar, snap-worthy if pulled at the right angle. When Joshua signaled Frank to prepare the papers to force Gavin's hand, he turned his back for barely 5 seconds. That was all Gavin needed. With a powerful twist of his torso, Gavin braced his entire body, pushed hard with his right shoulder, and yanked back. The wooden pillar cracked with a sharp snap. No one reacted in time. In one swift motion, Gavin slipped the chain from his wrist and hurled it around the neck of the nearest man, a guard holding a flashlight. The man collapsed, mouth spitting blood. Gavin immediately spun, whipping the chain into a second attacker, striking the jawbone, sending him sprawling into a pile of hay. Frank stumbled back in panic, dropping the folder to the ground. Joshua reached for a pistol under his coat, but Gavin was already on him, shoulder slamming into his chest, driving them both to the floor. Screams erupted. One man from the entrance shouted, "He's loose!" In the chaos, Gavin grabbed the folder Frank had dropped and stuffed it into his coat. There was no time to grab a weapon, no time for revenge. He barely caught a glimpse of one man pulling out a phone, but Gavin had already darted through the narrow back window like a shadow. A shard of glass tore across his shoulder, blood running freely, but he didn't stop. Not for a second. He vanished into the darkness the same way he'd once appeared in Fallujah, silent, without a trace, but leaving behind a fear that embedded itself in his pursuer's bones. In his hands, beyond survival, was irrefutable proof, a folder containing copies of grants and wire transfers from First Southern Union Bank to anonymous accounts, registered under civic organizations, but in reality, a front for an extremist network operating under the name Millbrook Heritage Society. The hunt had reversed. The man once chained now held the key to the downfall of an entire system. And Gavin, though blood trailed down his back, walked with his spine just as straight as when he led Delta Squad 3-1. This time, he wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting to expose the shadow Millbrook had nurtured in silence for nearly a century. 2 days after the harrowing escape, Gavin Johnson resurfaced, not in the town of Millbrook, but in an abandoned hunting cabin deep within the Chattahoochee National Forest, nearly 42 miles from his former residence. The cabin had no electricity, no traditional cell signal, only a hand-crank generator and a military-grade satellite antenna Gavin had installed from the emergency kit he'd kept since retirement. From that place, a counteroffensive began, silent, invisible, and precise as a dagger pressing against the enemy's nape. Within 72 hours, Gavin had deployed a high-intensity surveillance system. At the home of Carl Dixon, the mechanic who had followed him in the pickup, Gavin planted a miniature listening device concealed behind the living room wall socket. The microphone was designed to activate only when it detected human voices within a 4-meter radius, conserving battery and minimizing detection risk. He installed it at 3 a.m. while Carl was in deep sleep, after tracking his midnight bathroom routine for 5 consecutive nights. At the office of Ray Peters, the auto shop owner and frequent attendee of the Millbrook Heritage Society meetings, Gavin embedded a micro camera into the right eye of a lion statue on the bookshelf. The camera transmitted live footage through a hidden router Gavin had mounted behind an old vending machine, something no one paid attention to. In 3 days, he recorded nearly 7 hours of conversation, including clips of Ray bragging about Round 2 of the burn plan and the FBI escape key, stored inside a small sentry-safe vault. But it was psychological warfare Gavin used to seed fear. He didn't kill, didn't strike. He merely left traces that reminded them he was always present. On Joshua Briggs's nightstand, the morning of October 26th, sat a printed photograph. Nothing grotesque, just an image of Joshua sleeping. The angle, taken from above, through the second-story window. No note, no signature, just silence. Ice-cold silence. Joshua immediately installed 3 additional security cameras, hired a retired NRA event bodyguard, and replaced every lock on his property. But nothing could stop the panic slowly eating at his mind. Similarly, Frank Miller, the bank president, received an anonymous letter, with no postmark, placed directly inside his office safe. Inside was a copy of a hidden funding agreement from one of the bank's subsidiary accounts, sent to a front organization called the Liberty Sons Foundation. Frank understood instantly. Gavin had gathered enough evidence to expose both him and the bank. But Gavin wasn't just targeting Millbrook. From the hidden cabin, he used an AES-256 encrypted satellite connection to upload all gathered documents to a private FBI server. He used an old access path with a Level 1 passcode meant for Chen Domestic Counterterrorism Division. Agent James Chen, who had once fought beside Gavin during Operation White Cinder in Idaho, replied within 23 minutes. Received files. Verification in progress. Hold position. Internal operation under review. Limit. Direct engagement. Gavin understood the language. It was code for the FB. I was building an expanded case file. Any premature action on his part could alert the targets or cause evidence to be destroyed. While waiting for a federal response, Gavin continued gathering intel. He monitored the meeting schedule of the Heritage Society, tracked GPS data from an old phone Joshua had discarded, but Gavin had embedded a trace protocol into it the very first time Joshua came near the log house. Even powered off, the phone still pinged whenever plugged into a portable charger. One minor oversight, enough to map out the group's movement over the past 2 weeks. Every member of the extremist circle now lived in fear. They didn't know where Gavin was, who would be exposed next, or when the legal noose would tighten around their necks. As for Gavin, for the first time in years, he sat alone in the cabin, poured himself a cheap glass of bourbon, and allowed a faint smile to rise. This time I don't need a gun. I have the truth. Joshua Briggs had never imagined he could fear another man this much. Not because Gavin Johnson had guns, not because Gavin was trained, but because Gavin seemed to know every move he was going to make before he even thought of them himself. After more than 3 weeks without a full night's sleep, Joshua descended into panic, and when a vengeful man in power starts to panic, he becomes extreme and reckless. On the night of October 29th, at a warehouse on the south side of town, once used in the 1970s as a fertilizer distribution center, he summoned 37 members of the Heritage Society, including men from Alabama, Mississippi, and the eastern edge of Tennessee. All were familiar faces, trained in firearms and survival, most of them owners of semi-automatic weapons. Joshua called it the Final Shield. Inside the warehouse, they built a forest layout using old military maps. He pointed at specific zones. Eastern sector, near the dry riverbed. That's where he's hiding. We'll take him down before the FBI gets close. They equipped themselves with 12 AR-15s, 4 Remington 700s, 2 shortwave radio transmitters, an internal comm system, and split into 4 squads. There was even a mini drone with an infrared camera, purchased by Ray Peters from a surveillance gear website for hunters. But none of them knew. Gavin had lured them exactly where he wanted. Days earlier, Gavin had intentionally left false trails, staged footprints near the dry creek, empty rations bags, even a torn scrap of shirt tied to a branch. He constructed a battlefield illusion, something he had learned and applied in Kandahar when he lured an entire Taliban battalion into a gorge only 50 meters wide. Now, the Chattahoochee Forest had become a war zone. Gavin placed 19 homemade motion sensors, built from repurposed detectors, lithium batteries, and metal tubing, at key points within a 2-mile radius around the cabin. Each sensor was linked to a flash-bang charge, non-lethal, but enough to disorient anyone within an 8-meter range for 30 seconds. In addition, he installed reflective light traps using small mirrors angled precisely to reflect moonlight, momentarily blinding anyone who shone a flashlight. He also buried sound traps at key junctions, causing Joshua's team to believe someone was moving around them, when in fact, it was their echo. When the 4 armed squads entered the forest at 3:07 a.m., Gavin only needed to wait. By minute 11, the Eastern Squad, 9 men, was thrown into disarray by a series of flashbangs that caused 2 to trip and 1 to misfire on a teammate. The gunfire triggered panic in the Northern Squad, who believed they were being ambushed and split up chaotically. People began shooting each other in confusion. Meanwhile, the largest squad, 25 men, rushed into an old logging road, 400 meters long, only 3.5 meters wide, flanked by cliffs and dense woods. That was where Gavin had set up a U-shaped kill zone, a type of terrain no military unit would recommend, unless they wanted to be mincemeat. Once the group reached halfway, Gavin sent the signal from a handheld device, 3 short beeps, 1 long. And then, silence. No more radio signals, no GPS. Their entire communication system was jammed by a remote-triggered signal jammer Gavin had built, powered by a high-gain UHF circuit. It only worked within 500 meters, but that was enough to isolate the entire group. Inside that blackout zone, panic took hold. One man shouted, "Where is he? I saw something move!" Another barked, "Shut up! It's probably just a lizard." And then more gunfire erupted, not from Gavin, but from their own hands. And right at that moment, when the chaos peaked, the FBI helicopters arrived. Rotor blades shattered the silence of the forest. Spotlights lit up the logging road. A voice boomed through the loudspeaker. "This is the FBI. You are surrounded. Drop your weapons. Get on the ground. Hands behind your head." A second helicopter appeared from the west, and tactical teams deployed from the forest edge, armed, armored, fully authorized. None of the 37 men had a chance to retreat. None of them knew they had been baited from the start. From a high vantage point, where a camera recorded every move, Gavin gave a single quiet nod. His battle required no bloodshed, only preparation, intellect, and an unbreakable will. And this time, it was Millbrook that fell into the whirlwind of truth. After the helicopter lights sliced through the darkness, after the FBI's loudspeaker rang out like a death knell for arrogance, a stillness spread across the logging road, the stillness of surrender and collapse. But among the surrounding crowd, one man still refused to yield. Joshua Briggs, his face smeared with mud, one shoulder of his shirt torn, blood seeping from his temple, clung desperately to the last illusion of power. "Surrounds," he shouted with a hoarse, choked voice. "I want a duel! With him! No guns, no knives, just 2 men. We finish this like our ancestors did." The FBI moved to intervene, but Gavin, standing atop the hill, simply raised his hand gently. No words needed. He walked down the slope. His dark shirt was soaked in sweat, bare hands, a face marked by scars of the past, yet eyes calm like a lake before the storm. No one spoke. 2 men, worlds apart, stood face to face. One represented the darkness of history. Joshua, the offspring of torchlit marches and blood-stained oaths. The other, Gavin, was the embodiment of silence, endurance, and a rage forged over 20 years, fighting for a country that sometimes turned its back on him. The duel began. Joshua lunged forward with a right hook. Gavin leaned aside, dodging it as if he'd seen that strike 1,000 times in Fort Bragg's training camps. Joshua spun, launching a roundhouse kick. Gavin caught his leg midair, twisted it sharply, then swept his support foot. Joshua crashed face first onto the cracked ground. Without hesitation, Gavin stepped over, gripped Joshua's wrist, flipped him onto his back, and locked his right shoulder in a classic armbar, an old move every Special Forces soldier knew, as well as the alphabet. The sound of bones snapping echoed like dry branches breaking in a forest. Joshua screamed, but Gavin didn't. He didn't gloat. He simply leaned down and whispered, "Your war ends here." That sentence wasn't the fatal blow. It was a strike to the soul of every man left standing. Those who had once carried rifles, once cheered for heritage, slowly dropped their weapons. Ray Peters flung his AR to the ground, hands raised. Carl Dixon sat down, head bowed. Someone began to cry, not from pain, but from realizing that years spent believing in hate had just been crushed by truth. The FBI surged in, cuffing them one by one. In total, 37 individuals were arrested, without a single bullet fired by federal agents. Among them, the first to cooperate was Frank Miller. At the Atlanta field office, Frank, still in a wrinkled suit, crooked tie, and trembling voice, produced a 12-page list. On it were 43 extremist groups across the country that had received funding through fake, civil foundations, approved quietly by him and several bank partners over the past 6 years. The FBI immediately froze all transactions, traced server activity, and launched a coordinated operation with field offices in 11 other states. A sweeping investigation stormed through the nation, ripping the mask off more than 200 individuals, including local politicians, police officers, and businessmen who had donated to the Heritage Preservation Trust. In Millbrook, the next morning, the mayor held a press conference and declared, "The Heritage Society has been completely dismantled. This town begins a new chapter. No more crosses in front yards. No more strange vehicles circling the streets. No more eyes watching from across the road." Gavin wasn't present at the press conference. He didn't want cameras, didn't want medals. He stood silently on the 47-acre land, where he had bled, sweated, and endured. The wind swept through the oak trees. A flock of blackbirds crossed the sky, no longer chased away. For the first time in months, he began rebuilding the foundation of his home. And this time, no one dared stop him from raising a roof over blood-stained Millbrook soil. 6 months passed, like the end of a long exhale. Millbrook, Georgia, a land once soaked in blood and echoed with hatred, had slowly begun to open its eyes, as if waking from a dream that had lasted more than half a century. At the top of a low hill, on the 47-acre piece of land that had once been the eye of the storm, a modest wooden house stood newly completed. Trees had been replanted along the dirt road, and 2 sunflower beds turned brightly toward the sun. On the porch, Gavin Johnson sat leaning back in a rocking chair, his eyes quiet, but no longer on edge. In his hands was a cup of ginger tea. Beside him, an old radio playing a soft jazz tune by Chet Baker. His nephew, Malik, 8 years old, ran freely across the yard, holding a clear glass jar filled with fireflies. The flickering light danced on the boy's beaming face, as if the night was no longer a hiding place for ghosts of the past. Gavin glanced at his phone. A message lit up from the FBI's private communication system. Target acquired. Nathan Briggs apprehended at 05:17 a.m. 43 affiliate nodes neutralized across 7 states. Operation Ashfall concluded. He read the line 3 times, then set the phone down. Nathan Briggs, the founder of the Liberty Cross organization, Joshua's grandfather, a retired colonel who had hidden behind charities and rural development funds while running 43 extremist cells across the American South, had been captured. The organization he had spent 50 years building, with a financial network stretching from Mississippi to South Carolina, collapsed in a single morning. According to statistics from the Department of Justice, organized hate crimes across the region dropped by 60% within just 3 months of the arrests. Nearly 800 semi-automatic weapons, 200 homemade explosive devices, and over $2.1 million in cash had been seized. What had once hidden under the guise of tradition and culture was now unmasked as domestic terrorism. In Millbrook, the winds had shifted too. Jada, granddaughter of Betty Hawthorne, the girl once rejected from the high school science club simply for being black, had just received a full scholarship to study aerospace engineering at MIT. The letter was taped to Betty's refrigerator like a medal, and a photo of Jada in a white lab coat hung beside a picture of Betty's late husband, a former World War II combat medic. That day, Betty visited Gavin with a box of homemade muffins. She looked at the new house, then slowly sat down beside him on the steps, gently stroking the old hunting dog sprawled at their feet. "You know," she said, her voice raspy but still tender, "I've lived long enough to see many people leave, and too many die trying to change this place. But you didn't just survive, Gavin. You helped this whole town wake up." Gavin said nothing. He simply looked at the sky, where tiny lights had begun to rise from Malik's open hand. The fireflies escaped the jar one by one, glimmering like drops of light, rewriting the story of the night. He murmured, "A little light is still enough to shine through the dark." That night, no one burned a cross. No one threw stones at windows. No one watched Gavin from across the street. Only fireflies danced among the scent of fresh wood, the chirp of crickets, and a soft jazz melody drifting in the breeze, like a lullaby of peace that finally arrived after a war many never even realized had happened. And in every step Gavin took, every strike of the hammer he drove into the home he built, there was a declaration no one needed to hear aloud. "I'm here. I belong here. And I no longer have to ask permission." Finally, something had begun to change. Join us in sharing more powerful stories by hitting the like button and subscribing. Don't forget to turn on notifications to start your day with meaningful lessons and true empathy.